Hello, this is Mike Isbitsky, Technical Evangelist with Salt Security, and welcome to another episode of MythBusters API Edition. The goal of this series is to dive into some security trends that have resulted in myths for API security. Just a refresher, the format of these, we're going to be diving into the approach or technology. What does that mean? What's the baseline for that? Just to get everybody on the same page as far as understanding. And then we're going to talk about why that given approach or technology just isn't enough for API security, which results in this myth. Cloud service providers protect your APIs. This is a fun one. It kind of gets into security of the cloud as opposed to security in the cloud. Depending on where you are on your adoption of cloud services, which is usually part of digital transformations and DevOps journeys. Usually things are cloud centric, right? You get into this world of cloud native design. There's many different flavors of cloud compute, though, as we're going to get into today. That means different things, for your API security posture. But one thing is definitely common, and that's a lot of the responsibility of securing the applications, which includes the APIs, but also the data. It falls on you, right? The organization. It's not something the cloud provider will give you. So what do we mean by this, concept of security of the cloud versus security in the cloud? You'll see here kind of a visual that's very often cited by AWS, one of the prominent cloud service providers. This is often referred to as the shared responsibility model, but it's pretty well known, right? And I'd like to call out in particular, the things that are the customer responsibility. You can see, exactly as I was saying, customer data as well as applications are the responsibility of you, the consumer, right? That's not something AWS is going to be responsible for. They maintain the infrastructure. And this ownership it's clear when you think about it in terms of infrastructure as a service and traditional virtual machines and hypervisor security. But it gets a little more complex when you look at the other flavors of cloud. Another additional visual that's pretty handy and kind of breaking down these other flavors of cloud beyond infrastructure as a service to include other things like software as a service or platform as a service. Coincidentally, container infrastructure as a service, things like managed Kubernetes is also slightly different than IaaS, kind of fits in between IaaS and PaaS. But similar to that AWS chart there, the responsibility for applications and data falls on the customer, right? And it'll change slightly, based on the flavor of cloud, but that is a common thread. Right, the only time it changes if you're talking about software as a service. That's usually on the responsibility of the person creating that software as a service and offering it to you. They're certainly responsible for the application, but not the data in it. Right, that's still your responsibility. So things get a little more complex. Right, it's not so simple as it seems at face value, and certainly as you move into these kind of different levels of abstractions beyond kind of the well-known software as a service model and infrastructure as a service. Why is cloud security not API security? Well, let's kind of start with reference architecture. As I talk to practitioners, they often like to think of things in terms of architecture, specifically, more like a technical architecture, like what might things look like in an environment if I mapped some of the network components out and application services. This is a pretty trivial example of a sanctioned private cloud instance, so like a VPC or a VNet. And you're going to have application delivery controllers in there, network load balancers. You're going to have web servers, application servers, or there might even be some other services like email. But increasingly, email servers are actually facilitated by web APIs themselves, which gets interesting, right? And then you have your database, servers that are going to store data and facilitate access to data. But again, a lot of times those connections to data are actually via web API. And typically, APIs are mediated with API gateways. but you end up with sets of gateways or instances. There's typically an outer API gateway or multiple instances of them, and then moving more into inner architecture, you have sets of inner API gateways that typically do more fine-grained authorization, as opposed to that edge or outer gateway that's going to be doing the coarse-grained authorization. And they mediate access to APIs, right? In an API, you might be offering that as a service, but it's actually powered by microservices, right? Particularly if you're in the world of microservices architecture. These days, that's often kind of powered by container platforms and container clusters, right? So typically something like Kubernetes. Maybe you have a service mesh. Kind of really depends where you are in that technology progression. But this is a pretty standard depiction of what a private cloud instance might look like. Where do things start to go off the rails? Well, I mentioned provider managed Kubernetes on the previous slide, but Kubernetes is it's complex, right? There's a lot of moving pieces to it. So there's appeal in using something that's kind of operated more by the cloud provider, right? So abstracting some of the control plane elements to simplify that. So you start to end up in this world of application teams potentially procuring Kubernetes services that might not be sanctioned by the organization, right? So now you have APIs and data that you might not have visibility or awareness of in other clouds. And it can get worse from there, right? If you're getting into serverless, in the case of something like a function platform as a service, which includes things like AWS Lambda functions or Azure functions, there may not even be gateways in the mix, right? Your API code may just run and terminate. It can also just run things like script or general code, right? It doesn't even necessarily have to be a web API, but it's also unsanctioned, right? It's not something you have visibility into. And unsanctioned paths, right? Low code platforms. Might include things like Heroku, but this could just as soon be something like Salesforce, right? And the Lightning platform, where you're moving beyond that SaaS model, and now you're actually building your own functionality, which becomes a form of code. All right, you might expose that as a web API, but again, this is unknown or unsanctioned to the organization. Now, typically, what happens, as these APIs become more official or they want to be reused, there's going to be connections to them in your sanctioned infrastructure. So you'll uncover them in different ways. Your formal APIs might call out to these unsanctioned APIs and other cloud services. So this is a good way of kind of detecting them and then protecting them. But this is the reality of cloud, right? It's very easy to procure these things and spin up new workloads which run APIs. Why is cloud security not API security, right? That was the intent of what we're trying to get to here. Cloud providers, they're in the business of selling you infrastructure. There's various forms of that, as we've talked about, but the cloud providers don't offer mature API security capabilities, right? They might offer you an API gateway, potentially a web app firewall. They might offer you elastic load balancers and application delivery controllers, but these are kind of, in the case of those general purpose proxies like delivery controllers and load balancers, they're not doing much at the app layer other than kind of directing traffic, right? And when we talk about WAFs, we're going to actually talk about this in another episode of the series, but they're essentially message filtering mechanisms, right? And they lack context, so a lot of API attacks are just not caught by WAFs. So unfortunately, the cloud providers are just not giving you good API security capabilities as an option, right? It's not even something you're going to get inherently. It's on you to kind of subscribe to that, pay the cloud expense, and then actually deploy it and operate it. But they just don't have the capabilities. We talked about, cloud services are very easy to procure. That's a big reason that there are a lot of unsanctioned cloud environments running application workloads that you may not be aware of. And unfortunately, they're not always secure by default, right? Because a cloud provider is in the business of selling infrastructure, usually that means they want that to be an easy process, right? Business friendly, developer friendly, user friendly, citizen development if it's in the case of a low code platform. The thing needs to be easy to deploy. And security actually inhibits that, unfortunately, right? As we lock things down, it becomes harder to operate. And we've talked about this extensively. Unsanctioned clouds or cloud environments and data, it's a big problem, right? It really adds to your exposure. There's a very large attack surface you might be unaware of, and certainly distributed data that you need to protect. Thank you for watching another episode of MythBusters API Edition. Please check the Salt Security website for more blog articles, white papers, case studies, video content, much more. We're going to be producing a lot of content of written form and video form, hopefully physical events in the near future. As always, reach out to us with any questions, and certainly if you'd like a demo of the Salt Security API protection platform. Again, this is Mike Isbitsky. Thank you for watching.